it's a fantastic topic, and we must, at the beginning, thanks Panda for being with us on the first day of Parliament, and we're also expecting Mr. Rudy to join us in a few minutes. But let's just kick off the discussion and the debate, which I think is on top of our minds. We have, of course, Mr. Munjal, Mr. Bhasin, and Bibek, Debroy, who are going to be giving their thoughts on the issue. While we're talking about growth and stability, what I would like to actually raise the question with the panelists is that why is it that still, after such a lot of change in the economic growth of the country, why doesn't economic growth why is it not seen as political good? Why does economic good not become political good? Why doesn't growth translate? Why can't politicians, political leaders harvest the benefits of economic growth? I'm going to kick off by requesting Jay to respond to this, and then come to Bibek and Sunil ji and Pramod on this. Jay, please.
Pranjal, I'm going to start by quoting the IMF, which in a paper said that growth is easy to start, but very hard to keep going. And the way this interacts with political policy, as far as India is concerned, is I would say the following. The economic reform policies that we've followed for now 22, 23 years has never been sold comprehensively, not to the public and not even to the political class. And my experience through almost 13 years in Parliament has been that whatever reforms you've seen as governments have changed has been top down. It's been a core group at the top that has tried to push reforms.
Can I just interrupt and say that when we're talking about these issues, it's not just at the central level, I'm also looking at the state level.
I'm just coming to that. So the point is, if you look at political parties, irrespective of which political party, the economic reform story, the growth story, has never been sold to the rank and file. It's always been the top guys saying, this is a good thing for the country, let's do it, and succeeding to a lesser or a greater extent. So I would say that somebody like Prime Minister Vajpayee was a bit more successful, probably got through 60% of his agenda because of the way the politics was managed, a lot of give and take, a lot of behind-the-scene dialogue with allies, with opposition. And that political process, I think, faced a setback over the last few years. As a result, you've seen in economics. But the idea that good economics is bad politics has been disproven in many regions across the country. You hear about success stories like Gujarat, but increasingly you're also hearing success stories of Odisha, of Bihar, Chhattisgarh, so on and so forth. Many states which were for a long time considered basket cases. And the really encouraging part of the story is that in these parts of the country, regional political leaders have sold good economics as good politics, and the proof of that is that they're beating anti-incumbency and getting re-elected time and time again. Gujarat fourth term, Odisha getting ready for a fourth term, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, all into their getting ready for third terms. The tragedy is that this has not been done at a national level. And you have half a dozen states at least where good economics has been sold as good politics. I think the time is now coming ripe that the story can be replicated at a national level.
Thanks, Jay. Sunilji, the question which Jay answered, if things were looking better at the state level specifically, as he says, is it easier to do business? Is it easier to expand in the states? Is the resistance to growth and business expansion lesser in the states than at the national level?
Actually, it's been quite the reverse. If you see the policy changes that have taken place over the last 10 years specifically, because in the first few years of this reform, all of the action was only in the center. After about 10 or 12 years, kind of moved down to the states as well. And that started showing a distinction between the states, because some of them picked up on this quite quickly and started moving forward with reforming their processes, systems, even the administrative setup in some of the states started to get reformed. But not all of them did, and which is why we saw the extreme variation in the growth in states in that period. The interesting thing is, I actually quite agree with what Jay is saying. We've done a lousy job of telling even ourselves the good stuff that's going on. And therefore, not allowing that to become a multiplier, which it can.
Sorry, when you say we, do you include the industry in it?
India, all of us actually.
Okay.
We are all to blame for this because we've done, it's very easy for us to sensationalize because that's also become the style of the global information flow. If you look at the way media operates across the globe today, it only picks up in sensational stuff and more negative stories. The good stuff is harder to communicate because it doesn't sell. It doesn't make for good copy anywhere. So I think there needs to be a deliberate communication on what is being done, why it is being done, measure the impact, and then tell the people, not only of the good stuff, but also what did not work. Create corrective mechanism and say, by the way, we're going to try this again, and this is how it has worked. And you can see this in state after state which are doing this. There is clearly a change. And I'm not sure whether the growth and stability you're talking about is only these two, because there is a need also for economic stability. We've had a period, by the way, of 25 years until 2005 when we grew at near 6%. Very, very stable growth. Post that, we had very high growth. 8, 9%, over 9%, but it's been like a yo-yo, up and down all of this period. And that's creating a huge amount of disruption in the system. It's creating this fear of investing large sums for creating infrastructure, or even for creating capacity at this moment. This is a concern that I have right now. Not so much only what's going on right now, because this consumption cycle will turn around. I would imagine starting in the next 6 months. We will then hit a capacity wall. We are not creating capacity right now. So my concern, and that's going to affect your stability as well, by the way, is that inflation which comes in through lack of capacity will be very, very hard to tackle.
Thanks. Pramod, you also bring a global perspective. Is this just a communication issue that the industry and the political leadership has not been able to convince people the gains of growth, even though they are benefiting from it, their lives are changing? Or is it something deeper? For example, one of the issues is of crony capitalism, that what is happening. Right. So that's what I want him to.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, you know, Pranjal, these are all interconnected. So I totally agree with what Jay is saying, is that we haven't had a good discussion on it, but I'm going to be a little harsher, if I may, Jay, with a few notable exceptions like him. Our politics are divisive, intensely divisive. So they will, you know, this whole debate about FDI and retail and all of these things confuse everybody, and a lot of people, and people really don't understand where the politicians are coming from very often, because no matter what is happening, the other opposition seems to, at least in public, and I know they don't do it in private, but at least in public, they will stand up and oppose it for the sake of opposition. That's not a political process that can work. Many reasons for it, and I think Jay has alluded to them. You know, lots of backroom discussions that I've had to have, and lots of reaching out to each other, which doesn't happen perhaps as well as it should. So I think that's one. But two, you know, government still owns 40, 50% of total growth, industrialization, assets, etc., GDP in India. And our governments don't, public administration doesn't function. So food, water, schooling, education, etc., all of those things are leaking. Has the polarization of wealth increased over a period of time? Have all of those things happened? And that is being reflected in the mentality of both politics and economics and corporate India here, of saying, is this working the way it was meant to be? And it's under question. And it's not about, and crony capitalism showing up in all the scams puts that even more under threat. So it became, the message becomes incredibly clouded. And despite the fact that it's doing, India's overall indices are all very good, not all very good, sorry, that's a very poor statement. Many of them are good, certainly in terms of poverty alleviation, etc. It doesn't see light of day in the noise that is created to obfuscate those issues. I really think that's a large part of it.
Thanks, Pramod. Bibek, related issue, which is that, and I'll go back to the basics. Why does not a new factory or a new business activity or a socially developmental project at a constituency level benefit the MP or the MLA? What is preventing the candidate or the sitting MLA or MP from taking credit for it?
Before answering that, Pranjal, I'd like to sort of go back to some of the issues we were talking about and state them a little bit differently, and then I'll answer your question because I think there's a link. Let me begin by saying that I think there is a link between what we are discussing here and what we discussed in the last session. What I mean by that is what we have been witnessing in the streets, I do not think is only about corruption and sexual offenses and gender justice. I think it also reflects a great deal of resentment amongst urban youth at the fact that we were in a situation where we had 9% growth and 5% inflation, and that's become 5% growth and 9% inflation. And that does affect me as urban youth. It does affect me. It does not affect me in terms of abstract concepts like GDP. So I don't think GDP is the right thing to talk about at all. Governance is something I identify with. Development interpreted as roads, electricity, water is something I identify with. I endorse what J. Panda also said, that we must distinguish between the center and the states. And in the states, people who get elected, who have to go to the people to seek votes, generally tend to know what people want. The trouble, of course, and this is where I'm adding to something that Jay did not say or maybe did not want to say, is quite often policies are framed by politicians or non-politicians who are not elected in that sense. So they do not know necessarily what people want.
But you know, there is an advantage that if you have only people who are elected to form policy, they will be so populist that they will not be able to step away and take an independent decision.
No, I will come to that. If you want me to be direct, the National Advisory Council doesn't really know what people of the country want. People who are elected to Rajya Sabha, nominated to Rajya Sabha, do they really know what people want? I don't think so. Someone who's elected to the Lok Sabha generally knows what people want. Now we come to the question of communicating it to people. I think part of the problem is that in the rural sector, even 20 years ago, that message was very difficult to communicate because nothing was happening in rural India. The reforms were initially perceived as elitist, pro-urban, etc., etc. The difference being, now in some of the states, it is beginning to affect rural India. So it's become easier in some sense to deliver that message of development and governance, provided you are doing it. What I think is difficult, and I don't see why it should be difficult, is to tell people, look, there is an opportunity cost of resources. I'm not saying use the word opportunity cost. Even economists don't understand the expression opportunity cost. But in principle, if I'm spending money on this, you cannot expect me to spend that money on something else. There is a prioritization. And that is where I think there is a miscommunication. So far as the MP or the MLA is concerned, let's understand that there are some genuine concerns. There are genuine concerns mostly over control over natural resources, land, water, etc., forests. Those are not going to go away. There are costs and benefits. But what is important, and this is an additional point I want to flag, is there's been too much of centralization. And palpably in the last 5 years, things that are the province of states have been centralized and taken over, if you like, by the Ministry of Environment and Forests. So one reason is that we do not have enough decentralization. We don't ask people. Instead, there are people sitting here in Delhi who think they know what's best for people.
You know, that's an interesting point of debate, and Jay, perhaps you'd like to come in. There's also the feeling that people who are very close to the constituency, they take very narrow-minded decisions. What is good for my constituency, not necessarily what's good for the state or at another level for the country. So how do you reconcile the two?
This is basically an extension of your earlier question as to whether if policy making was left to elected representatives, don't they become too populist? Yes, there is that danger, but I think I have come from a private sector business background, and I've been now more than a dozen years in politics. And the more time I spend in the grassroots, the more I realize that there is an innate common sense and wisdom in the electorate that we undermine. So my answer is that the dangers of populism can be countered not by restraining democracy, but by having even more democracy. Let me give you an example. Now, when we have policy discussions, let's say FDI in retail, the problem was that there was not enough democracy. The government had years to sell the idea, didn't do anything. When it first attempted at the end of 2011, it sprung it suddenly out of the blue. And I remember we were a neutral party, and I was surprised that we weren't consulted because we were open at that point to being wooed and asked to support.
But if you're open to it, why do you want to be wooed? You can support it without being wooed.
No, I'll tell you why. Because there is always give and take in politics, right? And there is nothing wrong in demanding more for my region. There is such a thing as wisdom of the crowds, which overall, in a sense, will prevail over short-term, immediate populist measures. And I want to give you two examples. Think of the NAFTA debate in the US almost 20 years ago. How was that conducted compared to how our FDI in retail was conducted? We had no debate, it was sprung on us. And finally, when it did happen last time around, there was much more debate, but it was all concentrated in a period of 5 weeks rather than over a period of 2 or 3 years. Now, populism. Let me give you the example of Bihar. 10 years ago, everybody had given up on Bihar, thinking that here is a populist party that keeps on getting re-elected. When are the people going to realize that this is not delivering the goods? They did realize. It took 3 terms, but they did realize. And what works in Bihar today is a narrative in the political sphere which is far less populist. It is very much more based on Bijli Sadak Pani. So democracy may be a little slower, but it certainly delivers the result to you. So I have much more faith in the democratic process, even though you might have to have a little bit more patience with it. The problems arise when some people, elected or not elected, think that they can short-circuit the process and they can ram it down people's throats. That's when it gets stuck.
Sunilji and Pramod.
Two aspects I want to raise from what Jay just said. One is, what he said is a strength, but also our biggest weakness right now, is when you have a set of leaders who are able to take decisions with a varying set of interests. One good thing with the current state of politics is that the regions and the states have got much more importance than they ever got, because they are sitting in the center as well, and that's a positive. The negative of that is the inability of the entire system to align their thinking. What happens across the world, by the way, I'm talking about democracies right now, is that the opposition, while they oppose, but they also play a constructive role. The opposition and the ruling party agree on 5, 7, 10 things which are good for the country, and those will not be opposed at any level. They actually support them actively inside and outside of the parliament, and that is not happening in India. We've taken one end of the stick and just held on to just that. On the positive side, I think our process is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with the process. It's how we are actually running the process where there is a hurdle. We've also blocked the ability to go all the way down. We have laws in place for the Panchayati Raj institution. Why are we not empowering this? Why are we not financing it? And that, by the way,
why is it being undermined very, very consistently?
Being undermined by the political process at the top. So it is part of the same process. So we've kind of seen that this is where my benefit is. That this is a good process. If I'm not being benefited, by the way, the rest of it is not so great. So there is a need for us to sit back and take a hard look at this, is empower all the way down, and that institution is an absolutely amazing process. I don't know how many people in this room know how many people actually get elected, how many women get elected on this, since we were talking about women earlier. I don't remember the exact number. It's 1.3 million. And it's an enormous number. And these are elected representatives of the people. But their empowerment is highly limited. So can we allow the entire system to function? And as I said earlier, if we can if we build better communication, I'm pretty sure that we can do better than we're doing. And by the way, let's not run down everything we've done. while in percentage it doesn't look good, but the number of people who are doing better today in India is staggering. The fear is that
But
we
the
still have
sense of
250 million.
disenchantment and a sense of
Absolutely.
disillusionment is also high, despite having
I
more.
want to talk about this a little bit. Pramod, if you'll give me just 2 minutes more. There is a very, it's a disturbing trend. If you see over the last 12 years, there have been 3 trends across the globe. First, it said almost that all leaders are bad. Kings, presidents, prime ministers are evil. They're not just bad, they're evil. So he started a series of revolutions across different parts of the world. And this is a little expansion on what Bibek was saying. Second was business. Big business especially is bad. Business itself is not good because they take away resources, they're taking away my rights, they're using scarce resources for their own personal benefit. Third trend, and this is seriously disturbing, is anybody who's well off is against my interest. Anybody who's prosperous, wealthy, has got a job is actually not serving my interest. And this trend, again, is kind of sweeping many parts of the world, and which is why the model of capitalism itself is being questioned. And also, the model of democracies run in country after country is now being questioned. A combination of these is actually a little bit of explosive combination if not handled well.
So I think, Pramod, how can this be handled well?
Yeah. So quickly on the resentment of the pieces. You know, I think, totally take up Vivek's point about resentment because they are being badly served. They're being badly served by government. They're being badly served by corporate India.
No, but is
They
it
really
also
are.
that the haves have a bigger voice and they tend to resent more and it's more public than the people who are not getting it anyway and they're used to it?
Not at all. Not at all. I think connectivity today is at a level and at a point which is amazing and really democratizes India much more. Of course, there are probably 200-300 million people left out of it, but there is a large portion which is pulled into it by media, by what you do. And I think we haven't recognized adequately the level of change that's happening in our demographics. And our demographics are changing very seriously, and if you look around this panel and it's from lots of places, you know, you've still got a different generation running the country. That has to change. Connectivity is changing the way things work. Do we recognize how that works? No. Is corporate India changing the way it works? When I'm starting a skill development company, I cannot tell you how many companies I go to which are unwilling to make the investment in training and education and management and all of those things that you would think they need to do to get a very highly spirited and make investments for the long term. So I think there's a whole plethora of things which I think in this noisy process of democracy is improving, by the way. I really think it is improving. That to me is the most heartening thing about it. But let's not ignore the resentment that is out there at the ground level. And the last point I'll just make, back to Jay's point. You know, I think we're all a little tired of hearing a lot of people on TV defend the indefensible. And this happens all the time. And it happens if it's a case of somebody having said the wrong thing, some censorship happening which should be condemned by all parties as opposed to being defended by some for some reason. And it isn't, and the youth isn't stupid. They're smart, they're clever, they understand these things, and it disenchants them to a point where they become increasingly more resentful. Last one, 1 million people joining the workforce every month. 1 million. What are we doing? Where are they going? Where are the jobs? What's happening? I think these things will bring a cauldron. I'm not as surprised, Sunil, as to the points you're making. I think this is something we should expect to happen more and more. Understand. Understand. But I think, you know, it's going to happen more and more because that's the demographic nature. And I don't know if our structures are changing to adapt to that.
I'll just add one point that these debates and communication cannot happen only through TV debates. I'm pretty convinced about that. Rajiv ji, welcome. So you jumped right into the thick of it. so, you know what we're debating is India at the crossroads. Why is economic good not translating into political good? And why is it that an MP or an MLA cannot harvest the good which is happening in his or her constituency? Why is it that, is it an issue of communication, of not being able to share the good with the people, or is it that there is a deep distrust of both government, politicians and business working too closely together? Absolutely.
Well,
They've already had to go at it.
I'm sorry I'm late. I should have done
We appreciate you taking the time from Parliament.
Strict to get out earlier, but I couldn't. Thank you, Sunil, and thank you, Pranjal. Well, I was not privy to what has been discussed. But when we talk about political stability, and when you talk about politics, and when you talk about economics, I would still not like to make a reference what is happening. And we can attribute our slump of growth to the international reasons. It's very easily said, and whenever such situation arises. But I have a fair conviction about certain other things, why this is happening. And we are 60 years, 63 years down in independence. But I'm raising some basic questions, why this stability is being discussed now. And how in course of time, how regional aspirations and how the weakening of so-called national parties and the national politics, and how regional parties or regional aspirations are going to set the national agenda, and how economics is working on that. To begin with, a very small example, where in the world a government organization or a public sector undertaking, which is the largest public sector undertaking in the world, which has the largest number of employees, and has 1 million of passengers traveling, and a budget presentation is made by an individual minister in government. And within 24 hours, he is sacked. Where in the world a system of administration and politics can survive if you have a country which has the weaknesses of politics which takes charge of the national agenda? Why do I say this? There I can come back with many more examples. That most of us, I can speak for 30 minutes, 40 minutes on the achievements which we have made in this country. I've just heard the presidential debate, and we always try to tom and say that we have achieved through politics and 60 years of independence, 63 years of independence. But a person like me who has spent 25 years in active politics, starting at the age of 26, becoming an MLA in Bihar, and looking back around, I feel a person like me in the Indian political system, I personally strongly feel that I have more or less wasted my 25 years. And when I make this statement, I mean it. And for all those who say we have tom and achieved, I would personally feel that we have ultimately created a country of ordinary. And when I make this very harsh statement, I hold the political class and the political system responsible for this stagnation. The Indian political system, where you're talking about stability, is primarily addressed where in a world a political class who has to represent you, who has to get elected before he goes to file an electoral nomination, he has to give a certificate that he's not a thief, he's not a rapist, he's not a murderer, and he does not have so much wealth. And we are the people who have to frame the political system and get a stability in the system. I think there is a great debate which is required now on the issue of political stability. And if we continue with this of course, democracy, yes. But as long as you have a system where political representatives getting elected and holding executive position, we are the people who make law, we are the people who implement law, and we are the people who assess our achievement under a law.
But you know the point, Rajivji, is why is that development, growth, good economics, why is that not translating into a common platform across all political parties? We keep asking this question and we never find the answer.
I'll just take 2 minutes to conclude. I was wanting this question to be there. You see, when Pranjal holds an interview, or Arnab or Rajdeep, we come and frame ourselves in the forum as if we are talking about honesty, goodness, quality, merit. The Indian political system, where elected representatives like us, if we have to be elected, and if my party has to look for me as a candidate, or possibly Pranjal, or for that matter, Debroy, or anyone, or Mr. Munjal, the first thing in this political system which I will look for an electability of a person who has to become my representative is caste. Thereafter, I will look in his class, whether he's from OBC, he's a backward, who's a forward. Then I will look for his religion, whether he's a Hindu, or is a Muslim, or a Sikh, or an Isai. Then I will look for his geographical location, where he's Punjab, from Bihar. In Bihar, if I am from Chapra, I cannot contest in Darbhanga, which is Maithil. Then I would look for him that whether he has money, which he has in plenty. Thereafter, I will look whether he has muscle in a place like Bihar. And if all this fits you, I'll select you as a candidate. And if you get elected, merit is incidental, which is the last. And this is the political system which we have adopted. And all of us are getting together to talk how to improve this country when the whole pyramid is reversed. Political representatives like us have to fulfill all these criteria. Why, before an election, Mr. Pranjal, that the election commission has to seize 150 crores prior to every election? Why does a corporator in Delhi or Mumbai spend 3 crores? What business? You all are from the corporate world. What business is this for this political man to spend 10 crores or 5 crores to get elected? Because the political system is virtually collapsing. And if we do not address the present political system, where it is beyond merit, when you talk about stability, when you talk about growth, when you talk about aspirations, it is all linked to the political decision making, which is getting flawed every day.
So let me bring in Jay here. It's good to know, by the way, that there's at least one sector where there's adequate liquidity in the system. But Jay?
I share most of Rudy's concerns about the system, but I'm, in the end, more optimistic because I see the possibility of change happening. And I want to put this in the context. We earlier mentioned China. In China, I think the leadership figured out 30 years ago that if they can have double-digit growth, they can provide the goodies to their people to keep the system stable. Otherwise, they would rise up in rebellion. This goes to the point that Bibek was making, that as long as we were delivering 9% growth and 5% inflation, we didn't have these riots on the street. And it's only when we stopped delivering the goods to the people that we started having the riots in the street. Now, we had some sort of a broad consensus for almost 15 years. From 1991 to 2004, many governments changed. And some governments which were very distinctly left of center, like the 1996 UF government.
Absolutely, yeah.
Even sustained.
Because they cleared even the insurance privatization bill, which is fantastic.
Now, what happened was, I believe that the election results of both 2004 and 2009 were actually not expected. They were a result of bad campaigning. They were a result of certain other developments. And I think the winners were not only surprised, as Sunil says, I think they read they made the wrong analysis of it. And they decided to lurch leftwards in a big way, thinking that is what is going to keep them going. Now, just imagine if the same thing happened in China. If there's a new leadership change now, they've got this mandate, they've got this huge momentum. Suppose they decide that the last 30 years has been a mistake, and they go back to policies of 1977, 1978. It would still take 7, 8, 9 years before the resistance from the people would get to a point that the system would start cracking. Now, that's what has happened in India, because they reversed 15 years of ongoing reforms to go back to policies of essentially 1974. And it has taken 7, 8, 9 years for the headroom to run out in the economy. The system is fighting back. Fortunately, we have elections to remedy that. And despite all the problems that Rudy pointed out, yes, we have black money in politics. Yes, we have all these caste considerations. But I gave you earlier examples about how some of these are actually peaking. Now, in terms of caste politics, if you actually step back and take a cold, calculated analysis of the system, you'll find that the very peak of caste-based politicking was 1999. The entire decade of the 90s was entirely about caste politics. Look at the political rhetoric of the 90s and look at the political rhetoric in the last 5 years. You'll find that the most extreme caste-based parties of the 90s today have very, very substantially toned down their tenor and their rhetoric. Look at their candidate selection. They've realized that purely on caste-based selection, they have a plateau. They have stagnated. Beyond that, even the most extreme caste-based parties today have broadened or are trying to broaden their base, and you'll see the candidate selection from a very wide range of castes are coming in.
Let me ask Bibek if he agrees with this. Do you see this trend? Do you echo what he's saying? Or do you see that there are other...
On the caste part of it?
Yeah.
On the caste part of it, I think the more urbanization happens, the less important caste becomes. By the way, I completely agree with what Rajiv, Pratap, Rudy said, that in some sense, several of the things that we have done tend to perpetuate caste. But having said that, I think the more urbanization we have, caste becomes less relevant. I want to make two additional points. The first point is, in the foreseeable future, we will have a relatively weak center and strong states. And I'm saying this as something that's desirable. And there are certain systemic problems we have today in terms of managing union-state relations. The Interstate Council does not work, the NDC doesn't work very well, the Planning Commission, Finance Commission, they have inadequate representation from the states, all of that. And the system as a whole has not recognized that states are going to be important. Look at the way we continue to use the word center state. For God's sake, why? There is no center in the Constitution. The word in the Constitution is union. So one part of it is sort of institutional, systemic. The second part of it is that why has it become significantly worse in the last 5 years? And I'm going to stick my neck out and say this, because I thought someone else would, no one else has. I think we are reading too much into the collapse in the last 5 years, which is fundamentally 4 years, which is essentially an executive issue. What do I mean by that? If I have a situation where the Prime Minister of the country cannot pick up the phone and speak to any of the chief ministers, this country cannot be governed. If I have got a system where the government, where the party which is forming the government cannot talk to the principal opposition party, we cannot have governance. Now, these are not systemic problems. These are problems that have occurred in the last 4 or 5 years. I hope they go away.
I think Rajiv and Pramod want to intervene on this.
Well, sir, my only submission is we have a UPA government. Manmohan Singh is the Prime Minister. And a political worker or a citizen in Tamil Nadu who votes for a DMK candidate, what reference whatsoever does he have with Mr. Manmohan Singh? Has no reference whatsoever. Sorry for disagreeing with Jay. Yes, we have achieved. But a person like me who has been in politics for the last 24 years, I believe that in a country of 1,260 million people, this country which we are sitting here and discussing of the achievements and what we are, maybe this country is run for 100 million people. He would disagree, I would make it 200 million people. You'll further disagree, I will make it for 250 million people. But at best, 250 million people, this 1,000 million people in this country have no reference whatsoever. And this country is being just run for you and me, maybe some more beyond this hall. And if we are not able to look beyond and say that there are 1,000 million people in this country, and we are running a country, it's a country of ordinary. My appetite is, I'm 50 now, I've spent 25. My appetite is more. I can't continue with this pace of politics, and I cannot continue to live a life of ordinary. And if we do not, as politicians and the system, start recognizing merit as the priority, and cannot run this simply because emancipation, class, caste, this is going far beyond. And if we do not address the system today, I can give you in writing, we'll all will be alive. In next 25 years, you can find this country. What the Britishers did the biggest contribution, despite everything, that when they ceded, when they gave us independence, they left behind a geographical entity right from Afghanistan to Myanmar.